In the end, it was the iron box that saved them, though they did not know it when their fingers, numb with cold, first brushed against its frozen surface. What they knew was the wind, a relentless surgeon carving away at their resolve, and the betrayal, a wound colder than any Dakota winter. They knew the weight of every one of Martin's 72 years and every one of Agnes's 68. But this story does not begin with the discovery. It begins, as most endings do, with a home. For 47 years, that home had been a sod-roofed house built by Martin's own father, its walls thick enough to mute the prairie's constant sighing. The floorboards were worn into smooth valleys where Agnes had paced, waiting for Martin to return from the fields. He was a man of the soil, his hands a roadmap of calluses and healed cuts, each one a testament to a season of labor. He carried a pocket knife his father had given him and a quiet sense of ownership that had nothing to do with paper and ink. Agnes was a woman of thread and needle, her world contained in the intricate patterns of the quilt she stitched, each one a chronicle of births, deaths, and the long, quiet years between. Their life was a rhythm of shared tasks and comfortable silence, punctuated by the loyal presence of Rook, their German shepherd, whose aging muzzle rested on Martin's knee every evening. The dog, like the house, was part of the foundation. Into this quiet world came their son, Richard, and his wife, Amelia. They arrived not with warmth, but with the sharp, metallic scent of progress, their city clothes a stark judgment on the faded denim and calico of the farm. They spoke of efficiency and yields, of consolidation and futures. Their words were like stones dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading with a cold and undeniable logic. The final visit was in late autumn, when the sky was the color of lead and the air held the brittle promise of snow. Richard did not sit. He stood in the center of the room they had raised him in, a sheaf of papers held in his hand like a weapon. Amelia stood just behind him, her gaze sweeping over the worn furniture with a polite, dismissive air. "It's a matter of practicality, father," Richard said, his voice devoid of the warmth it once held. Martin looked at the papers, then at his son's face, searching for a flicker of the boy who used to follow him through the furrows. He found only a stranger wearing his son's skin. "Practicality," Martin repeated. The word felt foreign in his mouth. "This is our home." Agnes stood by the hearth, her hands tightly clasped. She said nothing, but Rook, sensing the shift in the room, rose from his spot by the fire and moved to stand between her and the visitors, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. "It was your home," Amelia corrected, her voice soft but precise. "Legally, the deed was transferred to us to secure the loan for our mercantile business. The loan has been called. The bank is taking possession of its assets. Which includes this land." The words were clinical, each one a nail hammered into the life they had built. Betrayal was not a single, violent act. It was this, the calm, rational dismantling of a lifetime by the one person you believed would protect it. "You sold it," Agnes said, her voice barely a whisper. "You sold our home." Richard had the grace to look away. "It was an investment that didn't pay. We have to be realistic, mother. There's no place for sentiment in business." He placed the papers on the table. "An eviction notice. They were given 1 week." Martin looked at his hands, the hands that had pulled stones from these fields, planted the seeds, and built the fences. They felt useless. He did not shout. He did not plead. A lifetime of dignity held him upright. He simply nodded. "I see." That night, after their son and his wife had departed, leaving the scent of their cold ambition lingering in the air, Agnes began to pack. She did not pack memories. She packed necessities. A side of bacon, a sack of flour, a small pot. She folded the quilt from their bed, the one with the interlocking rings pattern that told the story of their marriage. Martin sharpened his knife, cleaned his small axe, and filled a canteen from the well. He gathered the tools that felt like extensions of his own hands. Rook watched them, his intelligent eyes moving from one to the other, his tail tucked low. He knew. On the 7th day, as the first snowflakes began to drift from the sky, they closed the door on 47 years of their life and walked away. They had a mule, a few supplies, and a dog. They had no destination. They were simply heading west, away from the life that had been stolen from them. The prairie was a vast, unforgiving expanse of brown grass and grey sky. The wind was their constant companion, a physical presence that pushed against them, stole the warmth from their coats, and whispered of their foolishness. The mule, old and patient, plodded onward, its breath pluming in the frigid air. Martin walked ahead, his eyes on the horizon, reading the land for shelter, for water, for some sign of hope. He had spent his life in a 600-acre square of the world, and now he was adrift in a sea of it. Each step was an act of will. At night, they made a small camp. Martin would find a shallow depression or the lee of a rock outcropping to break the wind. Agnes would build a tiny fire of buffalo chips, its heat a small, defiant gesture against the immense cold. They ate sparingly, their meals a somber ritual. Rook would lie pressed against them, a living wall of fur and warmth, his head on his paws but his ears alert to every snap and rustle in the darkness. He would not eat until they had eaten. Their conversations were sparse, functional. "More snow coming," Martin would say, looking at the clouds. "The flour is half gone," Agnes would reply. The great, unspoken grief sat between them, too heavy to be given voice. To speak of Richard, of the farm, of the life they had lost, would be to give it a power they could not afford to acknowledge. So they spoke of the weather, the dwindling supplies, the state of the mule's left foreleg. They spoke of survival. The landscape began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, then to jagged buttes and deep ravines carved by time and water. It was harder country, but it offered more shelter. Martin felt a sliver of something that was not quite hope, but a lessening of despair. Here, a person could hide from the wind. Here, a person could disappear. The snows came in earnest, not the gentle flakes of their departure, but a blinding, horizontal assault. The world was reduced to a shifting curtain of white. They huddled together under a stretched canvas, the mule a solid, shivering bulk beside them, Rook curled into a tight ball at their feet. Agnes's hands, which had been chapped, were now cracked and bleeding. Martin's cough had settled deep in his chest. They were failing. The knowledge was a quiet, constant ache. They were too old for this. The thought, unbidden, came to both of them in the howling dark. This was how their story would end, two old fools and a loyal dog, frozen solid in a nameless drawer, a cautionary tale for travelers. The blizzard lasted 3 days. When it finally broke, the world was a pristine, silent expanse of white under a painfully bright sun. Their food was nearly gone. The mule was lame. Martin knew they could not go on much longer. They were camped in the shadow of a towering rock formation, a stark and desolate place that seemed to have been forgotten by God. He was scanning the rock face, his eyes raw from the wind and the glare, when he saw it. Not a cave, not at first. Just a shadow. A darkness that did not move with the sun. A place the wind could not reach. "Agnes," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He pointed. Look there as she followed his gaze, her eyes squinting. It was high up the scree slope, a dark mouth in the pale rock. It could be nothing. A shallow overhang. A trick of the light. But it was the only possibility they had left. The climb was brutal. The slope was a treacherous mix of loose rock and deep snow. Martin went first, kicking steps into the snow, testing each handhold. He tied a rope to the mule's harness, and together he and Agnes pulled the reluctant animal upward. Rook scrambled ahead, his claws finding purchase where they could not, turning back every few feet to make sure they were still following. They fell. They slid back. Their lungs burned with the thin, cold air. Each foot of progress was a victory paid for with their last reserves of strength. By the time they reached the opening, they were trembling with exhaustion. It was a cave. Not large, but deep enough to offer real shelter. The entrance was a narrow slit, but it opened into a wider chamber, dark and smelling of cold stone and dry dust. They stumbled inside, out of the relentless wind, and collapsed onto the floor. The sudden silence was deafening. Rook nosed at their faces, whining softly, then began a slow, cautious circuit of the chamber, his nails clicking on the stone. The mule stood with its head hanging low, its sides heaving. For a long time, no one moved. They were simply breathing. They were alive. The raw, primal relief of it was a physical sensation, a loosening in the chest, a warmth that spread through their frozen limbs. This dark hole in the rock was the most beautiful thing Martin had ever seen. It was a reprieve. It was a chance. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw that the cave went deeper. It was not just one chamber. It was a beginning. They spent the first day huddled near the entrance, recovering their strength. Martin ventured out to gather what little brushwood he could find, and with their flint and steel, they managed to start a small, smoky fire. The warmth was a miracle. Agnes made a thin broth from the last of their bacon and a handful of flour. It was the best meal they had ever eaten. Rook lay with his head on Martin's lap, his body finally relaxed. The cave was their fortress, the howling wind a defeated enemy outside its walls. That evening, with the fire casting flickering shadows on the stone, Martin decided to explore deeper. He lit their one lantern, its precious oil sloshing in the reservoir. "I want to see how far it goes," he told Agnes. She nodded, her hands busy mending a tear in his coat. "Be careful. Take Rook with you." The dog's ears perked at his name. He rose and stood by Martin's side, ready. The main chamber was about 20 feet deep and perhaps 15 feet wide. At the back, a narrower passage snaked away into the darkness. Martin held the lantern high and stepped into the passage. The air grew colder, stiller. The sound of the wind faded completely, replaced by the drip of water somewhere in the deep earth and the soft padding of Rook's paws. The passage was tight in places, forcing him to turn sideways. The walls were slick with moisture. After about 30 feet, it opened into a second, smaller chamber, a near-perfect circle of stone. And it was there, in the center of the lantern's golden circle of light, that he saw it. Tucked into a natural alcove, almost deliberately placed, was a dark shape. It was rectangular, bound with iron straps. A box. Rook approached it cautiously, sniffing at the rusted metal. Martin knelt, his heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He ran a gloved hand over the lid. It was cold, solid, and impossibly old. He tried to lift it. It was immensely heavy, wedged tight by a fall of smaller rocks. He went back to the main chamber. "Agnes," he said, his voice tight. "There's something. You need to see this." She looked up, her expression questioning. Together, they returned to the second chamber. She gasped when the lantern light fell upon the box. They stood in silence for a moment, two small, weary figures in the vastness of the earth, staring at a mystery. It took both of them, along with Martin's pry bar from his tool roll, to work it free. They dragged it back to the firelight, the iron feet scraping and groaning against the stone floor. It was about 2 feet long and 1.5 feet wide, made of dark, heavy wood and reinforced with corroded iron. A large, ornate lock, seized with rust, secured the lid. There was no key. Martin looked at the lock, then at the small collection of tools he had saved. It was not sentiment that had made him bring them, it was the ingrained habit of a man who fixed what was broken. He chose a cold chisel and a hammer. "Stand back," he told Agnes. He positioned the chisel's edge against the rusted hasp of the lock. The first blow echoed sharply in the confines of the cave. The metal was stubborn. Rust flaked away, but the lock held. He struck it again, and again, the rhythmic clang a stark contrast to the silence that had filled their lives for weeks. It was good to be doing something, to be applying force and skill to a problem. It was a language he understood. Rook watched, head cocked, from a safe distance. Finally, with a sharp crack, the ancient metal gave way. The hasp broke. Martin set the tools aside, his breath clouding in the air. He paused, his hands hovering over the lid. The contents of the box could be anything. Nothing. It could be a final, cruel joke played by fate. He looked at Agnes. Her face, illuminated by the fire, was a mask of anticipation and fear. He lifted the lid. The hinges groaned in protest and then were silent. Inside, there was no gold, no jewels, no treasure a thief would value. The first thing they saw was a thick, leather-bound book, its cover faded but intact. Beside it lay a small, carefully wrapped oilskin packet. And beneath that, a rolled-up piece of canvas, yellowed with age. A profound sense of disappointment washed over Martin, followed immediately by a deeper curiosity. Agnes reached in, her touch gentle, reverent, and lifted out the book. It felt heavy in her hands, dense with the weight of forgotten words. She opened it. The pages were filled with a neat, deliberate script, the ink faded from black to a soft brown. "What is it?" Martin asked, peering over her shoulder. "It's a journal," she breathed. She turned to the first page. "My name is Esther Vance," she read aloud, her voice soft in the firelight. "And I begin this record in the year of our Lord, 1849. I have come to this place not by choice, but by the hand of God, who has seen fit to take my husband, Thomas, from me, leaving me alone in this wild land." The words hung in the air, a voice from a generation past echoing in their stone shelter. Agnes carefully unwrapped the oilskin packet. Inside, nestled in a bed of dry moss, was a collection of seeds, corn, squash, beans, each type carefully separated. They were dry and hard, but they looked viable. Hope in its most elemental form. Martin unrolled the canvas. It was a map, hand-drawn with remarkable precision. It depicted the very land they were on, the rock formation, the creek that ran at the base of the hills, and a prominent spring not far from the cave. Marked on the map, in the same neat hand as the journal, was a small square with the words "My Claim" written beside it. Agnes began to read from the journal every evening. The fire would burn low, the wind would whisper at the mouth of the cave, and Esther Vance's voice would fill the space between them. Her story unfolded, a parallel narrative to their own. She and her husband, Thomas, had been part of a wagon train heading for Oregon, full of dreams of fertile land and a new life. But cholera had swept through their party, and Thomas was among the dead. Rather than turn back or risk continuing on alone, Esther, a woman of formidable spirit, had taken her portion of their supplies and struck out on her own, seeking a place to wait out the winter and regather her strength. She had found this cave. "This rock is my sanctuary," Agnes read, her finger tracing the faded words. "The wind cannot touch me here. The spring below gives sweet water. I have seen deer and antelope. I believe a body could make a life in this place." Martin listened, his practical mind fitting Esther's descriptions to the landscape he had observed. He found the spring she wrote of, a steady trickle of clear water emerging from a cluster of rocks, even in the dead of winter. It was a lifeline. Esther's journal was not just a record of hardship, it was a manual for survival. She wrote of the edible roots she found, the best wood for a smokeless fire, the way the snowdrifts formed around the buttes. She had spent a winter here, alone, just as they were doing now. But she had not been idle. With relentless determination, she had begun to build. "I have started a wall," Agnes read one night. "Using the fallen rock from the slope. My plan is a small house, just one room, using the cliff face as the back wall. A place to store my goods and pass the winter in greater comfort than this cave affords." The next day, Martin went looking. And he found it. Just below the cave entrance, half buried in snow and rubble, was the unmistakable foundation of a small stone structure. The walls were only a few feet high, the stones expertly laid without mortar. It was exactly where Esther's journal said it would be. He stood there for a long time, the cold forgotten, feeling a profound connection to this woman he had never met. She had not been defeated. She had built. The journal chronicled her hope. She had filed a claim on the quarter section of land that held the spring and the cave, drawing the map herself and having it witnessed by a traveling surveyor who camped with her for 2 days. The map in the box was her copy of that legal claim. Her plan was to travel to the nearest land office in the spring to have it officially recorded. The last entry in the journal was dated April 12, 1850. "The snows are melting," Esther had written. "The creek is running high. Soon the grass will be green. I have saved my best seeds for planting. I will make a garden. This place, born of my sorrow, will become my home. Tomorrow, I will walk to the ridge to see the way forward. There were no more entries. The remaining pages of the journal were blank. The silence that followed Agnes's reading was heavy with unspoken questions. What had happened to her? An accident on the ridge? A sudden illness? A chance encounter with less benevolent strangers? They would never know. All that remained was her labor, her words, and her unrealized dream, sealed in an iron box. Martin looked at the surveyor's map, then at the packet of seeds in Agnes's lap. He looked at the foundation of the stone house outside. Then he looked at his own hands. They were not useless. Her claim, he said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. She filed it. But she never recorded it. She never had the chance, Agnes said softly, her hand resting on the journal's cover. A deep and terrible irony settled over Martin. His son had used a piece of paper, a deed, a bank note, to take everything from them. And here, in a cave in the middle of nowhere, another piece of paper, a hand-drawn map from a dead woman, was offering them a new beginning. It was more than a claim to a piece of land. It was an inheritance. A duty. That night, Martin did not sleep. He sat by the embers of the fire, the weight of his 72 years feeling less like a burden and more like a foundation. He had been a farmer. He knew land. He knew stone. He knew how to build. The knowledge, which he had thought was now worthless, was in fact the most valuable thing he possessed. Esther Vance had laid the foundation. It was up to him to finish the work. The next morning, when Agnes awoke, she found him already outside, clearing snow and rubble from Esther's wall. He worked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, his movements economical and sure. He was not just clearing away debris. He was preparing to build. Rook sat nearby, watching him, a sentinel guarding a newfound purpose. Agnes brought him a cup of warm broth. He took it without stopping his work. "This is good stone," he said, his first words of the day. She knew what she was doing. With the coming of spring, the land transformed. The brown, dormant grass gave way to a carpet of vibrant green. Wildflowers bloomed in the shelter of the rocks. The air, once sharp with cold, was now soft and smelled of damp earth and new life. The change in the landscape mirrored the change in their spirits. The despair of the winter was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of purpose. Martin worked on the stone house every day. He used the skills he had learned building fences and foundations on the farm, fitting the stones together, using mud and grass from the creekside to fill the gaps. He dismantled the old wagon they had dragged the mule with, using the seasoned wood for a roof frame and the canvas for a temporary covering. It was slow, back-breaking work, but his body, which had felt old and broken, responded to the labor. The muscles in his back and shoulders hardened. The cough that had plagued him all winter disappeared. He was building a home. Agnes, meanwhile, tended to her own domain. She found the spot near the spring that Esther had likely chosen for her garden. The soil was rich and dark. With a sharpened stick in her bare hands, she prepared the ground. She planted Esther's seeds with the care of a priestess performing a sacred rite, pressing each corn kernel, each bean, into the soil. She talked to them, whispering words of encouragement, willing them to break through the earth and reach for the sun. She was planting a future. Rook took to this new life with an air of profound satisfaction. He had a territory to patrol, a home to guard, and his people were safe. He would spend his days trotting the perimeter of their small valley, his evenings asleep by the fire, his body a warm, solid presence in their small stone house. One afternoon, a man on horseback appeared on the ridge, a lone rider silhouetted against the sky. Rook announced his arrival with a volley of deep-chested barks. Martin and Agnes stood together in front of their half-finished house, watchful and wary. The man was a trapper, his face weathered and bearded, his clothes made of buckskin. He raised a hand in peace. "Howdy," he called out. "Didn't expect to find nobody settled here." He dismounted and approached slowly. "Name's Ben." Just passing through, he looked at the stone house, the neat patch of garden, the wisp of smoke from their chimney. "You folks built this?" "We're improving on it," Martin said. Ben nodded, a look of respect in his eyes. Takes a strong back for that kind of work. He stayed for an hour, sharing his coffee and news from the world beyond their valley. He told them a land office had opened in a settlement 2 weeks' ride to the east. He never asked where they came from or why they were here. The prairie had its own etiquette. You didn't pry into a person's past. When he left, he gave them a small bag of salt. For the garden, he said. His visit was a punctuation mark. It confirmed they were no longer hiding. They were living. They had been seen, and their existence had been acknowledged. That evening, Martin looked at the map again. When the house is done, he said, I'll ride to that land office. We'll make her claim our own. By midsummer, the house was finished. It was a single, sturdy room, warm and dry, with a solid door made from the last of the wagon wood and a chimney that drew perfectly. The shelves Martin built were lined with Agnes's neatly folded quilt, their few pots, and jars of dried herbs she had gathered. Outside, the garden was thriving. The corn was knee-high, the bin vines were climbing the poles Martin had set for them, and the squash plants were spreading their broad leaves across the ground. The sight of the green, growing things filled a space in Agnes's heart she thought had been permanently hollowed out. One morning, Martin announced he was ready. He would take the mule and ride to the land office. He packed Esther's map and a letter Agnes had helped him write, explaining their situation. He would be gone for a month. Agnes felt a pang of fear at the thought of being alone, but she pushed it down. You go, she told him, handing him a parcel of journey bread. Rook and I will guard the fort. She watched him ride away until he was a small dot on the horizon. The days of his absence were long and quiet. Agnes worked in the garden, preserved the first of the beans, and read Esther's journal again, this time not for guidance, but for company. She and Rook fell into a comfortable routine, their solitary life a quiet testament to the resilience they had discovered. When Martin returned, he looked tired but triumphant. He carried a new piece of paper, an official document from the United States government, stamped and sealed. It declared that the quarter section of land, encompassing the spring, the cave, and their new home, was registered to Martin and Agnes Miller. The land was theirs. They did not celebrate with shouts or fanfare. Martin simply handed the paper to Agnes. She held it in her hands, the same hands that had planted Esther's seeds, and tears streamed down her face. They were tears not of sorrow, but of a profound and quiet victory. That evening, they sat outside their stone house, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Rook lay at their feet, his head resting on Martin's boot. The air was warm, filled with the scent of their own soil. They had lost a home, but they had found a place. They had been betrayed by their own blood, but they had inherited the legacy of a stranger. Their life was not what they had planned, but it was theirs, built from rock and hope, earned with their own hands. It was enough. It was everything.